Hey everybody, this is Dan Keldsen with NextFutureToday. The interview that I just wrapped up is with Dr. Abbie Morano. She has a PhD in behavioral science and is the director of training and education at a company called Social Engineer out of Florida. And I found her because of a mutual association with Rachel Kassar, who's the CEO of Virtual Sapiens, a software company also based in Boston like we are. And Virtual Sapiens essentially does analysis of how you're presenting on camera, how much space is there around you, how quick or slow do you speak, do you look all over the place when you're presenting, which might be distracting. It's very interesting. It can be a live assistant to help guide you through what you're doing and show more energy and all sorts of things. It's really interesting. They're constantly tweaking it. Dr. Abbie is on the advisory board, and Rachel interviewed Abbie recently, and all the behavioral science stuff is very fascinating. So we're going to talk about that in this interview as well. And then the social engineering piece of what our current job is as director of training education has, at least for me, a really interesting twist on it as far as behavioral science goes, that if you care at all about security and privacy on the internet, among other things, that piece might really catch your attention. I highly recommend that you find out more about the company that she works for, Social Engineer, and her work. In the meantime, if you care about how you're being perceived on camera, how you are understanding others by watching them on camera, which is very different than the millions of years of experience we have with being in person with people and reading non-verbal cues and communications, then this is going to be a really interesting conversation for you. I don't want to ruin too much about what we talk about, but she is very passionate about what she does, and I think you really are going to want to know much more about Dr. Abbie once you have gone through this interview. But let's see, and here we go. Dr. Abbie, it is so wonderful to actually have a chance to talk to you in real time and not just watch you do your thing on other podcasts. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I found out about you through your interview with Rachel Kassar at Virtual Sapiens, and I understand you're on the advisory board, so that's cool. She's got some very smart people that she's pulled in, which is very wise of her and smarter than me, perhaps. And you have a background in behavioral science. You are a behavioral scientist. So
yes.
What does that mean? I don't want to make any assumptions and not mislead our audience. So what does that mean in a sort of practical sense?
So behavioral science is a pretty broad term. It's basically just the study of what we do. It's just the study of people. So There's a misconception when you say like behavioral scientist or psychologist, they go, oh, you mean mind reader? And no, we don't mean mind reader. It doesn't give you access to people's thoughts, but it gives you access to an understanding of the mechanisms behind thinking. So you learn to understand human behavior and human thinking rather than, people's thoughts.
That makes sense. There's a lot of, I'm far from a behavioral scientist, but I've read a ton of things like Joe Navarro, who I believe you studied with. Mark Bowden is a big fan of Plexicam, so I've gotten to know him pretty well, and he does an awesome job of explaining things too. It does make me slightly nervous when I talk to people that have your background, because then I think, what am I sending when I'm moving my hands, and do I look interested or bored? So
it definitely puts people on edge when they ask what you do, and you go, I'm a behavioral scientist. I examine nonverbal communication, and especially my background is information elicitation. So people get very uncomfortable very quickly.
So I didn't, until I met Mark, I didn't understand that there was a more subtle difference between, let's just call it body language versus nonverbal behavior, which is sort of bigger and I think more nuanced. One thing that I think is interesting to me, so there's, we're millions of years old. The brain has evolved a lot over time. Maybe not as much as we could all stand, but, we're getting there. So there's that pressure of, it's sort of built into us that we're wired for fight or flight or, things like that. And then we meet the world that we're living in the last 3-4 years, which is COVID and post-COVID and being on camera. And I think that, at least for me, it seems like other people that I talk to, because I have a lot of clients that are on camera all the time, that's part of my world, they're not really aware that the things that they learned sort of intuitively, or it's just in our DNA, pretty literally, they're forgetting all that stuff when they're on camera. So that they, like Mark talks about height dominance. So if I was, standing up like this, it's bizarre, right? So, if you did that in person, it'd be very uncomfortable. Doing it over Zoom or whatever, also uncomfortable. But it doesn't seem like most people are aware of that. So what do you see about is that evolutionary stuff that's pushing on us unconsciously? We're not paying any attention to it, and the things that maybe we should be doing to present more and understand what we're seeing on camera.
Yes, so as you said, the awareness of nonverbal communication, and not necessarily conscious awareness, unconscious awareness, we're constantly reacting to other people's behaviors. That's ingrained into us. It doesn't go away just because we are online. So the same way we respond to facial expressions in person, we respond online. But because it's a change in modality, people don't necessarily realize that it's the same. Like when the pandemic happened, you really saw a split because a lot of people recognized how important nonverbals are. And then the other part of people thought, well, nonverbals aren't important now because it's all virtual. And you see this big split between success and effectiveness of communication. And the people that recognize that nonverbals play just as an important role virtually, well, they have more successful interactions. And actually what we do see is we see the same effect of the same nonverbals, but we see a greater effect now virtually, not because there's any percentage of nonverbals that matters versus verbals, but because now we're in a static environment. So I don't have other distractions taking away my attention. Everything I see about you is in this block. So now I don't see your leg movements. I don't see a changing environment. I don't see even anything to do with your lower body. And usually I don't see much of your hands, usually just because of how the screen is. So what I do see carries so much more weight because now I'm going to make all my assumptions on you based on your environment. And the difference that you said about nonverbals and body language is really important online, because what you notice is people's backgrounds often are very untidy, very unprofessional, and they think, doesn't matter. People are just judging me on my body language.
Right.
They're judging you on everything they can see in that screen. So everything in that screen is an extension of your nonverbal communication, not just your body language.
Right. So when things are within your control, it is, thank God there is a border around here somewhere, so you can't see the things that are not visible to the lens, because there's I'm sure we're all hiding things. What do you think as far as how do we get people to pay attention to that? Because it's very common that people have the if they have a built-in camera, it's at the top of their screen, but the person they're talking to is low on the screen, maybe very low on the screen compared to the camera lens. Is there anything? Is there anything that you do or that you recommend to break people out of that so they are more aware of that and why it's not doing them any good at the least?
Yes. So we know in person that eye contact is, a sign of active listening. There is nothing more frustrating than if you're talking to me and I have my phone in and I'm looking at it or I'm looking down. It's so rude. It's one of the most frustrating things. And, there's a Jordan Peterson quote. He said, if you're talking and they're not listening, stop talking. And that's how we feel. If someone's not listening, we're like, I don't want to communicate with you. The same happens in person. But what this virtual world does, it creates a barrier. So we don't feel that it does as much. We feel kind of protected. It creates almost like a buffer between us and them. So they're like, they don't know what I'm doing. So, they don't know what I'm looking at. They don't know I'm looking at my phone. So I'll just keep peeking down. They're not going to notice. They notice. We're sensitive to it. Now, there is a lot of back and forth in the literature of where should I look when I'm speaking? Because what we do in person when we're speaking is we look at the other person. Now, virtually, we go, do I look at the camera lens or do I look at you? Because you on my screen is in a different position than the camera lens. Same as I'm in a different position than you. So I can see your eyes move from person to camera lens. And there's a big kind of discussion over, do you look at the person or do you look at the camera, and does it matter? What matters is consistency, because say I'm in a group, you don't know if I'm looking to the left or the right, if you're on my left or right. But when you're speaking, you expect me to be looking at you. So what you're going to look for is not exactly where my eyes are, but the consistency of where my eyes are. So my eyes are going to consistently stay in one place because I'm looking in the appropriate space. Now, obviously, looking right to the side is completely different. You notice that. But if I'm looking in one place while you're talking, and then my eyes are slightly moving down or slightly moving up, that's what we notice. So when someone is speaking, and when you are speaking, keep your eyes on them. Now, what we do is we look at ourselves, and that's noticeable. So we look at them, we look at us, we look at them, we look at us. That is noticeable. And it's also really fatiguing. And there's that thing called Zoom fatigue that's been shown in research. And it's because we only have a limited capacity for what we can take in. And nonverbals are very consuming, especially when we're really focused on them. We think, okay, I've got to sit up straight, got to do this with my hands, or they're watching me. That takes a lot of mental energy. So we lose what we're saying because we're focused so much on what we're doing. Now, when we do that in person, we lose the ability to be a really good observer because our resources are on us. So when I teach people to improve their nonverbals, I teach them, don't assess your nonverbals in person. You want to do it in private, in practice, and become fluent in nonverbal skills. It takes time. So you're not consciously focusing on what am I doing, it just comes very natural. Virtually, like if I stare at myself this whole time when you're speaking, it's going to really drain me and I'm going to get fatigued. So you're going to notice my eyes darting. You're going to notice as well I start to get disengaged because I become fatigued. And all of this stuff we don't really think about because we have this buffer behind this screen. But those little movements and, you looking at yourself and not looking at me, we notice them. And even if we don't consciously respond, we unconsciously respond. We feel disengagement.
Right.
Yeah.
So part of your work, you do training on nonverbal communication, and both observing and sending, I think is how you refer to it.
Yes.
Those are terms? Okay. And so you do that in person. Were you doing virtual sort of coaching before COVID?
So I've never done training virtually for nonverbals because I always say the importance of being in person. But I'm actually releasing my first virtual training class next month. We decided we have to stop fighting it. People are interacting virtually, and we wanted to teach them virtually because we always teach in person to get that rich social experience. But Mia and Chris sat down together and we said, why are we teaching a virtual class in person? If we're teaching people how to improve their virtual nonverbals, why don't we teach it virtually so we can actually lead by example?
There's the nonverbals, there's also the verbals, and
Yes.
there's other pieces. So as far as the verbal communication goes, when it's in a virtual world, Zoom, whatever, versus in person, are there certain things that you've observed that people are just not managing well when they're talking in a virtual situation?
Yeah, people get very anxious. And so even the way you say something, so the power in your voice, things like that, that is still nonverbals. And it's a misconception because they're like, it's the voice. How can it be nonverbals? It's called paralanguage. So it's the nonverbals of the verbals. So it's not what you say. For example, how long I pause between words, that's a nonverbal aspect, and that's the paralanguage. And people forget that, or they don't realize that is nonverbals. If I say to you, thank you for having me, versus thank you for having me, same thing. Verbals are the same, but it has a complete different effect. And people don't recognize that as much. And because they don't have a setup, the microphone on a laptop can make your voice very robotic and it's uncomfortable. Like when the screen is blurry or very pixelated or the voice is very robotic, we know that isn't that person, but our brain doesn't. So we might consciously go, yeah, they're not pixelated. That's not how they speak. But the brain is unconsciously reacting. And you said at the beginning, the brain is very old. We're still living with parts of the brain that we had millions of years ago. Those parts of the brain aren't adapted to virtual communication. And that's the limbic system. It assumes we are in person and it responds as if we are in person, even if we're not consciously, even it's unconscious, even if we're consciously aware, it still tells us you don't feel as good about this interaction.
So do you think it's really, it's not just about the equipment that people have or their internet connection, but there's like paying
the
more
way
attention.
You speak to. Yes. Okay.
That's interesting. And I do think, so we have a number of actors and actresses who are also clients for Plexicam. And one of the things they mentioned is that, especially if you have a teeny tiny camera. So it seems, I thought that was a really interesting observation, that if you just put some more effort into sort of pushing your message through without like being aggressive, which feels like it could be a kind of subtle thing. You need more energy, but also you don't need to terrify people on the other side.
I think when you're training nonverbals, that's a good way to train, to consciously put a little bit more effort in. But what I always tell clients is you want your good nonverbals to be part of your natural behavior repertoire. You don't want to be asserting energy, because everything we give out takes from something. We are limited, and we want to give the best interactions, the best influence, the best leadership approach that we can. So we want as much resources as we can to think about what we're saying, to think about what they are saying, so we can respond appropriately, because we want to be active listening. So as you're speaking, I'm trying to pull apart what you're saying to think about, what does he care about? What is he really telling me? What's important to him? Rather than, what am I going to say? How am I going to respond? So when you're practicing being a little bit more energetic, I would say absolutely. But once you become a little bit more comfortable with your nonverbals and a bit more fluent, then I would say any exaggeration is taking away from something else. You want your natural behaviors to be a little bit more exaggerated naturally, but it just takes time. And I don't think that many people have realized the importance of virtual communication until recently. So people are still learning. We're still getting to grips with how comfortably can I communicate.
Sure. And just a little plug for Virtual Sapiens. So if you are interested in practicing and having some objective analysis of how you're being seen on camera, I would recommend giving that a try. I think there's still a free trial. It's been a while since
so they do. Rachel has these practice interviews I think are really, really effective. Because how do we practice for an interview? Before the interview, it's really difficult to practice talking to yourself. So she's recorded herself asking you questions, so you can answer the questions and you're being recorded while you're doing it. And then it will automatically assess your nonverbals.
Why don't we spend some time, and maybe we'll hit it deeper in a different conversation. But your current work at Social Engineer. So I know what social engineering is, but for people who are not aware of what that is, what is social engineering?
Social engineering is the attempt to influence somebody, basically, to get information from someone or make someone perform an act that may or may not be in their best interest. So we're social engineer professionals, so we protect people's human security network, whereas a malicious social engineer is someone that will try and gain information from you to fraudulently take your money or commit identity fraud.
Right. So what brought you to Social Engineer as a company? You could have gone a lot of different ways. You probably still will, but why there?
So it's a long story, so I'll try and give a short version. But I always wanted to be an academic. My goal from when I was 17 was to be a professor of psychology, professor of behavioral analysis. And when I was 19, I published my first research paper. I kind of dived into psychology, fell in love with it. And from that moment, I was like, yes, I want to be a researcher. So I spent my whole time focused on research, and I was in love with nonverbal communication. So my research was around nonverbals. And I got a scholarship to do my PhD with CREST, so Center for Research and Evidence and Security Threats. And they're funded by Military of Defense. So it put me in the security sector. And that's how I got to work with the motion capture suits and study nonverbals in the forensic setting, looking at information elicitation, because it was under CREST. But while I was still finishing my PhD, I got a lectureship. So I became a lecturer, and I thought, this is what I want to do forever. And I realized I didn't find it challenging in the way that I thought that I would. I thought that every day would be not knowing something and having to figure it out. And that's what I love. That's why I became a scientist, because I love the research, because there's a question that you don't know the answer to. So you go, I'm going to dedicate the next few years of my life trying to figure out an answer, because there are answers, we just don't know them yet. And I thought that I would feel that as a professor, but the academic environment wasn't what I expected it to be. And it kind of started draining from me. I didn't want to get up and work, and I realized something has to go. And at the time, I was working a lot with Joe Navarro. He was my mentor, and then as I became a professor, we kind of became colleagues. And he said to me at the time, I can see your love for the field is draining. I can see that you're not happy. And he said, you need to do what I do. And he was a big speaker, and, is a big speaker and an author. And he said, you have more to give than where you're giving it. He said, you need to be in business. So he took me into some of his talks and his trainings, and I realized that it was a very different environment being in corporate. And he said, we need to get you into the corporate world. And he started getting me on podcasts, and he wanted to put me on Chris Hadnagy's podcast. And we had a meeting, and Chris was just asking about the research that I do. And he said, I actually need a director of education. Do you know anybody that does the research that you do? And I said, no, nobody does the research that I do. And that's how I do it. That's how I got it as my PhD. So
Sure.
hire me.
Okay.
And he was like, you want to move to Florida? I would move to Florida in an instant. So it was my time to leave academia. And he said, well, I need someone that specializes in nonverbals, has some experience in information elicitation, that, knows about behavioral science. And I said, that's funny, because I'm a behavioral scientist specialized in nonverbals and information elicitation. So I thought this could be a good fit. And it was almost like the job that he wanted, and he wanted someone to create courses. And at the time, I had just created a forensic psychology BSc, a whole forensic psychology program. I'd created like a 10-module, 3-year program. So I was like, actually, I love creating courses. He was like, great, when can you start? And I said, how quickly can you bring me on? Let's get me a visa, let's go. And I remember I accepted the job. He hadn't told me anything like salary or anything like that. I just said, yep, I want it. You want to talk about, the details? Details are fine, but I want the job.
Wow, that's amazing. Huh.
Yeah.
You never know where opportunities are going to come from, and they're not.
Yes.
Like, could you have made that happen? Maybe, but probably
so
not.
I think when you work really hard, sometimes it seems like luck happens. I had said to Joe, this is so lucky. And Joe had said to me, this isn't lucky. He said, how many weekends have you taken off? And for me, my career is my life. I don't have like a me and then my work. It is who I am, and it is something that I love. And there will never, ever be a separation between me and my work. It's just the way that I've always functioned. I work my weekends. I work very long days out of choice. And when I have some free time, I go, what can I do that's work related? And, I'm not a big social person. I don't drink. And to get my PhD at the age that I did, I'd see my family once a year. I wouldn't really go out. I could count the amount of holidays I'd taken off in the whole, 3-year degree. And it seems like sometimes these good things happen out of luck, and you think, oh, it just fell on my lap. But actually, when you work really hard every day, small move and small move consistently, you're building that. And then when I think back to the amount of rejections of, before I got this PhD, the amount I applied to that all said no. And then this was the perfect PhD and fully funded. Whereas the others, I would have had to pay my way. Whereas this one, I was paid. So it seemed like, oh, how lucky. And it was like, actually, no, I was resilient from all the other rejections. And each time I got a rejection, I learned and I built on that. And then I improved. So when it came to this one, I had all that behind me. So Joe reminded me, he said, it's not luck. It's the outcome of consistent hard work that feels like luck.
Right. You make your own luck. Is another way to do it. Yeah. Yeah. And that's I forget who says, a lot of people are afraid of work because it comes dressed in overalls and it's dirty.
I don't think I've heard that.
It's something like that. It's kind of like the show Dirty Jobs. Somebody asked, all the jobs that are done by somebody, right? So people who crawl in sewers, that is a job. People that take out the garbage, those are all jobs, and they're not easy, right? And most jobs are not particularly easy necessarily. And it is interesting how part of the reason that I like to do interviews like this is to reassure myself that I'm not totally insane, because my career's happened because I've been podcasting off and on since 2006, and that has opened up a ton of opportunities for me because people can see what I do and how I do it and how I present and do I think. I'm not an attacking kind of interviewer. I try to have a real conversation, and that means that I don't like to sell. So for me to be out there, people can find me, and if they believe that I'm a good guy and maybe I can help them, then they just reach out to me, and then I have the choice of saying no thank you, or yes, or let's talk more details. But it's interesting how it flips the sort of dynamic there in a very useful way.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it definitely does. And it's like you said, those small moves, and you think, okay, well, I'm not going to be there in 1 year, but maybe 5 years I will be. And if you really care about it, then that's fine. Day by day, consistently work hard. I have this conversation a lot about, when you get an opportunity to excel your career, but you have to do it at the expense of your integrity or at the expense of, pushing someone else to the side. I think it can be tempting to do that because you think, I really want this. In the long run, it's not going to be effective for you. Work consistently. Take the slower path, the consistent slower path, the honest path. Show people you care about them. Don't just want to be perceived as trustworthy. Be trustworthy. Try not to do harm to people. And that's a misunderstanding as well about social engineering. When they meet practitioners, they think that your role is to elicit information from people by any means possible to get the win, to prove that their security network or their human security is weak. It's not at all. We believe very strongly in the ethical premise of you do no harm, and influence and malicious influence are completely different. We don't play on fear. We don't play on anger. We play on trust. We never create psychological harm to get the job done. And when you do that, you leave people better off rather than leaving people feeling shame.
That'd be awesome. I know that we're about to run out of time. So I'd like to close out. Is there anything that you're particularly excited about in behavioral science or the work that you're doing?
Yes, I love that question because there's always a lot that I'm excited about in the research field. I'm excited with the advancement of technology in the field of behavioral science because it allows us to connect neuroscience to nonverbals. So when I observe a nonverbal, what is going on in my brain? And there's some really interesting research looking at when we perceive people behaving a certain way, what's the hormone response to it? And that stuff really excites me. The biology of nonverbal communication I find just absolutely fascinating. When we self-touch, when we're nervous, if we look at the brain waves when we self-touch, what happens is it creates more calming brain waves. So you can actually see, when we teach that people self-touch when they're nervous, now people have a greater understanding of this actually is a calming effect because we can see it in the brain waves. That stuff, I find when you give a biological foundation to the nonverbals, it helps people recognize that this is a hard science. It's not, just soft, wishy-washy pseudoscience. Yeah. It's a hard science founded in biology.
Yeah. Fascinating. All right, we're going to run out of time. I don't want to be late to your next meeting. But Dr. Abbie, thank you so much for going along for the ride of our conversation. Really enjoyed it. And I do think we should talk more about the social engineering.
Yes,
probably a lot of
definitely.
things, but we'll talk more about the social engineering stuff. But thank you so much for making time for this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. See ya.